Our panel topic this morning is very timely, but it's also, of course, very broad. So accordingly, I thought I could best contribute to today's discussion by opening with remarks that are going to cover America's calculus of intervention, those factors which are shaping and complicating it. And then secondly, drawing upon my own personal experience, providing some lessons learned for us all, I think, from the long war in Afghanistan. First, 4 factors that are influencing and shaping today, at least, America's calculus of intervention. First of all, the difficulty America has faced since the end of the Cold War in defining a coherent and a consistent international security strategy. In formulating its security policies, America, starting in the early 1990s, subsequent to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but especially after 9/11, has placed far greater relative emphasis on national safety as opposed to safeguarding sovereignty and on U.S. and allied territorial defense. But various formulations of our security policies have not translated into an overarching grand strategy. And this is a fact, and it's really not intended as a criticism, as over the course of world history, effective great power strategies have been highly contingent and frankly rarely observed. We're left then with a set of U.S. security policies that are conditioned by what we could call various orienting principles, such as non- and counter-proliferation, financial sector stability, reduction of greenhouse gases, and the responsibility to protect. Prioritization is extraordinarily difficult due to the cross-cutting nature of most of these issues, and accordingly, the value of proposed interventions are frequently subjects of hot debate. Second, the serious fiscal and political problems that the United States is still experiencing and has experienced over this past decade have diminished its appetite for intervention. And this is clearly reflected in the Obama administration's security strategy, notably in the 2012 defense guidance that identified national economic well-being as a primary goal. Even in President Obama's 2009 speech at the United States Military Academy, where he ordered an additional 30,000 troops into Afghanistan, he limited the scope of the mission by saying, and that's why our troop commitment in Afghanistan cannot be open-ended, because the nation that I'm most interested in building is our own. And third and related, the American people's skepticism of the use of force has grown over this past decade due to concerns about the cost of the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, measured against very questionable gains. This skepticism has been mischaracterized as war weariness. Why do I say mischaracterized? For a people to be weary, they would have to have paid a price. And with an all-volunteer armed force and huge deficit spending to finance all United States government expenditures, the vast majority of Americans simply are not bearing any direct or visible cost for military interventions. Having said that, however, given their deep concerns about domestic issues, such as government gridlock, unemployment, and the cost of health care and education, these coupled with the disappointing results of the 2 protracted foreign wars that we've fought, the American people are, for now at least, telling their elected representatives that they're not at all enthusiastic about committing to new foreign conflicts. Consequently, debates over United States strategy, for the moment, are including very loose, ill-defined concepts such as restraint, offshore balancing, and occasionally the term neo-isolationism. Fourth and last, the historically cyclical argument within the United States government over the war-making authorities and responsibilities of the executive branch and the legislative branch has returned, and this has been a matter that's been unresolved since America's founding. I think that these 4 factors then together have provided the context for United States decision-making, most recently during the ongoing Syrian crisis. And they're helping to shape other consequential United States government security policy decisions as well. An example, the current downsizing that's going on in the United States, the American Armed Forces, includes comparatively larger cuts in our Army than it does for the Navy, the Air Force, and even for the Marines, as it's assumed that the likelihood of another extended expeditionary ground campaign is unlikely in the near through the midterm. Yet I also would say that we should not overinterpret today's context, which will certainly change as threat perceptions and America's political economic standing evolve. So let me turn now to lessons drawn from America's intervention in Afghanistan, these being based upon my 2 military and 1 diplomatic posting to that country over the past decade. I have 5 lessons, and they're interrelated. First, if the establishment of a representative democracy is taken as the ideal way to ensure a previously failed or so-called pariah state can reliably administer responsible sovereignty to its people and over its land, then we need to at least remember that it's a long way, say, from Kabul to Copenhagen. As my friend Steve Krasner at Stanford University has written, if we are trying to get to Copenhagen, there's 3 theories of development that we might draw upon to guide our way. Number 1, modernization theory. And this assumes once you're on the escalator going upward, you just keep going up. 2, institutional capacity theory that contends that social and political institutionalization is key to promoting modernization, and that accordingly, the escalator can go up or it can go down. So you could get on at Zimbabwe, say, in 1985 and find yourself worse off in 2013. And third, elite competition and bargaining theory that argues that only if elites are beholden to a broad base of social support will institutions be welfare improving for society as a whole. In other words, you can get on the escalator in France in 1780, but where you will be when you get off, only God knows. No one theory is compelling or dominant. We know that organizational forms of liberal democracy are relatively easy to transfer, but the substance and culture of institutions are certainly not. We also know that liberal democracy follows their own trajectories. So intervening with the hope of transforming a conflict-riven, underdeveloped country from no rule or despotic rule to an accountable democratic state is very similar to high-risk venture capital investments, except that state transformations are infinitely more complex and outcomes much more difficult to predict. It's absolute hubris to assert with a high degree of confidence that hoped-for transformations will occur. We applied all 3 development theories in Afghanistan over some 12 years and at a huge expense, and outcomes still remain in doubt. Conclusion, be modest, be humble, and be realistic if part of an intervention's success is contingent upon socio-political economic transformation. Second, regarding efforts at transformation, when setting the level of ambition, one must consider the time and resources available and the probable sustainability of the enterprise. In Afghanistan, I can tell you there was an assumption on the ground, not only by the Americans, but by most of the international community, that the mission would continue forever. And efforts to build institutions were often open-ended, and they were overly ambitious. This applied to, among others, attempts to build and strengthen the Army, the police, provincial government capacity, the banking system, the agricultural sector. I could go on. The ancient Chinese strategist Sun wrote, "There's never been a protracted war from which a state has benefited, and an electorate and their representatives will inevitably conclude this at some point after their nation's intervention. And a sound strategy up front must take this into account. When helping a war-torn, still conflict-prone society, think post-intervention fiscal and institutional organic sustainability. Plan for exit even before arriving. Third, on finding post-intervention political settlement or equilibrium. Major powers often believe that a two-step process follows a decision to intervene. First, defeat the regime against who the intervention is aimed, and then second, help constitute a new government. In fact, the defeat of a regime can create an entirely new dynamic of conflict within a country that can confound efforts to deliver political stability. We've seen this both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Indeed, in Afghanistan, the singular focus on Taliban has obscured the fact that for many decades, the problem was the absence in that country of national political reconciliation, Taliban being merely a symptom of a much larger and a much deeper political problem. Fourth, on the role of concerned major and regional powers in ensuring stability after the withdrawal of the intervening force. The prospects for the establishment and the maintenance of peace in a weak and a conflicted state greatly diminish if there is not an agreement among the relevant major and regional powers to act in concert to respect the sovereignty and guarantee the security of that state. The lack of such a consensus is a particularly acute problem in Afghanistan. Trying to build such a consensus prior to an intervention is preferred, but regardless, establishing one after intervention is essential. Fifth and finally, at the point a government does make a decision to intervene militarily, opportunity costs begin to rise exponentially. Dispatching armed forces into combat is expensive, and it quickly becomes a dominant domestic political issue, amplified daily by the media. I was struck when I was the ambassador in Afghanistan in Kabul how consumed Washington was not only by matters of policy and strategy in that country, but even over questions of operations and tactics as well. While gratified that our embassy and our military command were the objects of such attention, I also worried about what was being neglected by Washington in the greater world at large at that time. Drawing upon all of these experiences in Afghanistan, the cautionary note then before future interventions is to look before you leap. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.